I once again emerge from my study, Rufus Nation. I have spent all day enriching my mind with the unending wisdom of Freshie Canal rap battles, which are certainly not just rotting my brain, but I've also recently finished Bojack Horseman Season 6, and by extension the entire show, and one of my amazing patrons asked me to rant about the show holistically, as well as give my opinion on the trope of each penultimate episode of a season being considerably less optimistic than the actual finale of the season. So I guess we'll just get right into it. There's a lot of places to start. The first thing that comes to mind is the penultimate episode of Season 6, which is called The View from Halfway Down. I have a friend who was telling me constantly that this was like the best episode of the series and that I had to see it and that I had to talk to him after I saw it. And I can definitely see why. It essentially acts as the climax of the entire series. Every single hang-up that Bojack's had in his life and every single like really major event and really major passing, really major death sort of culminates in this one episode and comes to a climax in this one episode. There's crazy reveals, dark reveals, amazing monologues, emotionally resonant moments, like some of the most emotionally resonant and candid moments in the entire series. It fades out from this like bleak conversation with Bojack and Diane, which does kind of actually represent, or parallel rather, the ending of the final episode as well. But I think the biggest and most obvious strength of The View from Halfway Down is just its nature as a extended dream sequence, and that entails it essentially just being one giant visual metaphor, normal metaphor, whatever you want to call it. The show gets to get a lot more artsy. It gets more comfortable with shooting unorthodox shot compositions, which it seems to do just throughout the runtime of the series. It's been doing that for a while. But, you know, those sort of artsier shot compositions that frame visual metaphor in a very emotionally resonant manner. So I definitely appreciated just the visual spectacle of The View from Halfway Down. There were multiple performances. That was sort of the motif of the latter half of the episode, that each character would do some sort of onstage performance before jumping into the nihilistic void of nothingness. And particularly, Bojack's mom's performance was actually pretty visually spectacular from like a cinematography standpoint and a choreography standpoint. It was legitimately really good. I was like thoroughly surprised that it was so well done, frankly. But there's just it's framed, the episode is framed by so many iconic scenes, iconic locations, the bridge, the pool. There's just so much to love about that episode. It is truly the climax of the series. It doesn't come out of nowhere, but in a sense, it is very jarring and shocking to see, because the last episode doesn't show you the last thing that chronologically happened before Bojack has this dream. The last episode kind of leaves it fairly unclear, and it's slowly revealed to you over the course of the episode that, yeah, Bojack is currently drowning and on death's doorstep, essentially. And that's a really cool, really eerie concept. He gets to sort of relive all of the most, I mean, it sounds messed up, but the most interesting, because they are the most emotionally intricate and stressing parts of his life, unfold or, you know, show themselves one final time all at the same time. It's just super emotionally powerful, and it does so much for sort of leading to the conclusion of Bojack's character arc. The episode after The View from Halfway Down is a lot more mundane. You get a lot more normal moments, and it's sort of revealed that a lot of people have more or less moved on from Bojack in their life. A lot of Bojack's problems and a lot of his general actions that he takes and personality traits that he dons are because of a sense of, I don't know if superiority is the right word, but he has a sense that he is special, and by extension more special than other people. And this season finale really highlights the entire show. He feels like the main character. It is the Bojack Horseman show. You keep coming back, at least I kept coming back, for Bojack Horseman, for his just long, winding roller coaster of a character arc, and just all of the increasingly fantastic ways in which he self-sabotages. But in this finale, which is indicative of what's to come for these characters in the future, Bojack feels like a background character almost. Like, he is not driving the plot. He is not the center of attention. A lot of people have more or less just moved on. Hollyhock, Princess Carolyn gets married. Diane essentially moves on in the last scene of that episode. He loses people, which I think is a very fair ending for Bojack, because the show sort of walks a tightrope of being very critical of his actions, but also humanizing them to a very great extent, which I think are two things that are, definitely very good. But there was a worry that somehow if they gave Bojack just a happy ending and he reforms and it's all good, then it would feel like they were excusing his actions, and then that would send the wrong message to the audience. But at the same time, they didn't want it just to have a total downer ending, like if it just ended on The View from Halfway Down, because that sort of promotes another message of hopelessness and nihilism, which the show had addressed many, many times throughout its runtime. The issue of nihilism and just the general terror it brings upon this world is fairly frequently confronted by Bojack Horseman through various characters. Mr. Peanutbutter, of course, Bojack himself, Princess Carolyn's whole arc. Like, there's a lot of things in this show that reflect the idea that time marches forward and we have a limited amount of it. And once we're out, we're out. So we really have to make the most out of whatever life we're living, essentially. So they didn't want to give too much of a downer ending that's demoralizing to people and sends a message that they can't change, but at the same time, they didn't want to come off as excusing the actions of Bojack. So they make it so that they have this big dramatic, quote-unquote, downer ending where Bojack, of course, jumps into the pool and almost dies. But then they have this actual last episode, which shows a positive trajectory for Bojack, but is essentially defined by the things he loses. The problem is that he's hurt so many people in the past that even if he does reform, he will always be just in, like, shitty debt. Like, he will never be able to undo the shitty things he's done. But it's sort of like he finally starts to get that thrown back at him in this universe, saying, like, okay, the things that you've done in your past have caused you eventually to go to jail, which caused you to lose your friends. And that's something that you just sort of have to deal with. They simply grew apart. That's a consequence of your actions that you are going to have to deal with, but it doesn't mean that your life is over. You have to be accepting of that, but you also have to keep moving forward, as Aaron Yeager would say. But that finale was terrible. This finale was good. So I'll keep talking about it. I'm trying to remember some of the shots from the last episode. Of course, there was that, like, super emotional final shot of Bojack and Diane that lingers for, like, a long time and just sort of magnifies the just emotional paralysis and, like, solitude of that scene. Like, it's just so somber. There's so much to reflect on with this, like, really complex story just coming to an end. And you know it's coming to an end, and these characters still have a lot of life to live, but the story has made its message clear, and, it's over. It's definitely a very sobering moment, no pun intended. It's a very sobering moment to end off the series on, and honestly, I was incredibly satisfied with the ending. As far as the character arcs themselves go, I'll try to just go over what I believe to be, the 5, maybe the 6, the 5 main characters of this series. It might be 6, we'll figure out as we go. Just gonna address them as they come to be in my mind. So the first one I'm thinking of is Diane. Diane is a girl who is incredibly feminist. She is very social justice minded, And she has a lot of criticisms and general anger at the world, much of which is very justifiable. She feels like oftentimes her voice is just not heard, which roots all the way back to her childhood, and that is incredibly frustrating to her. I believe her desire to have her voice heard and her indignance at her inability to do so is what drives her to dedicate herself to becoming a writer. And I think to some extent she resents that the fact that she had to go through all that dedication toward the latter half of the series, when it turns out that there is no grand finale direct result of the work she put in that she can call the thing that made all that pain worthwhile. I believe the term she uses, good scars. She didn't have any good scars. She didn't have anything to show for all the work she felt she had to put in for reasons that are totally not her fault. And, you know, I definitely really feel for her. The story ends on a note of sort of self-acceptance for her. It's like the Bojack ending, where it's not just a totally happy ending for her, but to a lesser extent because her sins are much less pronounced. But it sort of just starts more of a journey of self-acceptance and ability to further her understanding of other people more than anything else, because Diane as a character lashes out a lot, but at her core, like all of us, she really wants to connect with people. That's why she went back to Vietnam. That's why she has so many hang-ups about her family. And that's probably why she clings to Bojack so much, or at least one of the many reasons she clings to Bojack so much, because she just wants people around. Like, she wants to connect with people. She wants to find her people. She wants to feel important to them, and she wants to feel heard. That's why she breaks up with Mr. Peanutbutter. That's what drives her to do most of the things she does. That's why she's a freaking writer in the first place. And yeah, that's mostly where Diane's sort of arc goes. It's just climaxes at, okay, I need to stop saying that word, but it culminates in Diane sort of moving towards self-acceptance more than anything else, I believe, as she becomes more aware of why she feels the way she feels. And sort of, it's interesting because she gets off of her quote-unquote moral high horse, but the only reason that she's on the high horse is because she's like super morally insecure, which is a very common thing. So sort of once she has to become grounded, she becomes incredibly depressed because the incredible standard she holds everybody else to, she also holds herself to, and she's disappointing it. So it's just a mess, and Diane essentially has to start reworking that from the ground up, and that is sort of a lot of where her arc ends in the series. She spends a lot of it being mostly in the right, even though she obviously does terrible things throughout the whole series, just here and there, or at least bad things throughout the series, just here and there. She's generally, at least when compared to Bojack, like in the right and being logical, but her essentially realizing she has a problem and realizing what in particular the problem is and beginning to move forward is sort of where the story ends for her, and I don't mind that. Bojack himself, I mean, it's hard to nail down just like one main problem that he has that he had a character arc to overcome. Like, what is he? What is his problem at the beginning of the story? Is he just trying to stay alive? Is he trying to kick alcoholism? Is he trying to learn to respect himself, attain some abstract sense of parental approval, assume a functional life, find a new start, relive his former glory, leave his old life behind, find somebody to have a serious relationship with, just to be happy? Like, just for attention? That it's very unclear what Bojack's main problem is, at least to me. But he definitely suffers from, this isn't going to make sense to anybody, but I don't even know if I'm pronouncing it right, but what I call cuckoo syndrome, because the March comes in like a lion, where essentially his parents made him feel like his existence was a great burden on them. That is the gist of it. He feels like him merely existing is a sin in itself, and obviously that does terrible things to somebody's self-esteem. He didn't get any parental validation ever, so of course he went seeking that out from other places and became a comedian of all things, where he was sort of at the mercy of the validation of the crowd. But also it's interesting because in real life, I always thought, comedians are just some of the most broken, and like intellectual. It sounds so stupid when I say it, but I do really believe this. Introspective people on the planet for some reason. A lot of them have sort of arcs in their careers where they start to dip their toes into general societal commentary and like activism and stuff like that. At least all of the most famous and respected comedians do. And it's definitely very interesting that so many people follow that career path when they have such dark pasts or such dark minds. So I guess it totally makes sense that Bojack would go through that avenue in terms of how he was going to try to fill that hole, that lack of parental approval left inside of him since he was young. But it being comedy is not all that important because it's also acting. Of course, acting is pretending to be somebody that you're not, pretending to have the answers to problems you don't have or not have problems that you do have. And that is one of the most major themes, not only of Bojack's character, but of the entire series. It takes place in Hollywood. It is a very thoroughly American Hollywood story that is just revolves around themes of American Hollywood that are true in the real world, the fakeness of a lot of people there, and the fakeness of their lifestyles, and the fakeness of their just emotional wellness. That is a very prominent theme, which Bojack exemplifies to a very, very great degree. So I guess if I were to lurch onto one character arc for Bojack, it would be his sense of, okay, well, realizing there's a problem, of course, but then coming to terms with the fact that he is not this big shot that he thinks he is, or that he thinks he is. He is very emotionally disturbed and wants to live a simple life and is in search of the same things we're all in search of. He doesn't need all of this stuff, and all of this stuff isn't him, and he basically has to realize that he is not the center of attention, and it's probably not good for him to be in the first place. Also, I mean, it's hard to just relegate Bojack to one character arc, but I guess if I had to, that would be the main one that I would go with. Princess Carolyn. Princess Carolyn's entire arc is just this balancing act of work life and home life, essentially. She has all these aspirations. She is a thoroughly, like almost radically independent character. She wants to do everything on her terms, and she wants to be able to do everything she wants to do. She is incredibly accommodating to other people, though, and is willing to just totally bend over back for everyone, because it seems like she just wants to believe that she's in total control and she can get anything done, no matter what it is. She mentions at some point that she enjoys putting out fires, but I think there's just a sense of control in being able to do everything for everyone else and still at the end of the day be like, yeah, and I'm doing everything for myself. So how great am I? Princess Carolyn eventually realizes, though, after a couple of failed relationships, that she really, really, really wants el bebe. She wants un bebe. And that is obviously an enormous responsibility. As we know from this show doesn't shy away from the idea that how parents treat their children, especially when they are at a very young age, is incredibly impactful on how they will be and how they will grow to impact the world when they get older. So the show knows that this is an incredibly serious task, but Princess Carolyn still wants her work life. She still wants to sort of have her cake and eat it too. And in the end, she actually is able to, through almost sheer willpower alone, but also just a sort of understanding of her situation and a willingness to let go of her work at times for her family and for her family time. She ends up marrying a very autistic, or I don't know if autistic would be the right word, but he's very far along some spectrum, guy that she worked with, and that was her assistant, who, you know, is also very serious and business-minded, just as she is, but cares about her and also, ostensibly, wants to have a family. She ends up adopting a baby, and she wants to teach it all of the great things that she has learned through just all the hard work that she's put in. It's revealed in one episode that her mother was kind of a butt, and she's the reason that Carolyn wanted to be so hyper independent. There was a moment in which her mother said that she would finally make it because she happened to accidentally get pregnant by some like rich dude, and like, okay, this was finally her big break. Like, she is a person who is not going to have a big break. She's not born to have a big break, and now she has one because of something that she didn't even do on purpose, that she did on accident, a baby. And she really internalizes that and rages against that and seeks out on not living for anybody else, which is a really ironic goal when deep down you have a lot of these these complicated emotions surrounding starting a family and being in a family, and you really want to have a baby. You have to devote your time to somebody else, and devoting your time to other people is devoting your time to yourself, because in the end you're doing it for yourself. This series is very much about the nature of selfishness. This series is also very much about the nature of time and how we're all marching toward the end of time. This series is about the mask who wear, of course. The series is just about a lot of things. So there's a lot of there's still 2 more characters to get to, but I guess these are the simpler ones. The last 2 characters I want to talk about are Todd and Princess Carolyn. I just did Princess Carolyn. Sorry guys, the Freshie Canal rap battles are really getting to me. But Todd and Mr. Peanutbutter, same thing basically. I recently had a conversation with my sister about Todd and Mr. Peanutbutter, because she said that she just didn't care for Mr. Peanutbutter as a character, but she loved Todd. And she sees why other people love Todd so much. But I kind of felt the opposite. I never disliked Todd, to be very clear. He was my favorite character towards the beginning of the series. It just kind of wore out for me a little bit. His whole Todd shtick. I just kind of got a little bit over it by the end, but it was never really like particularly annoying or anything. It just sort of became less interesting to me. But Mr. Peanutbutter, I liked for whatever reason, I found Mr. Peanutbutter to be more charming than Todd, even though he's clearly a more overtly flawed character. And maybe that's why it introduced this very weird debate in my mind of what matters in this archetype of character. What makes one of these characters preferable in my eyes to the other? Even though, of course, you can have whatever favorite you want. Like, what makes me like Mr. Peanutbutter more than Todd, when clearly, like, you know, at least on the surface, they have a ton of similarities. They're both, like, essentially endlessly positive to a cartoonish extent. Everything always works out for both of them. They're both dumb, you know, in some ways. Todd could be considered smart, he just doesn't think. Or he could be considered dumb, but he does think. I don't really know. But clearly there is some sort of deficiency somewhere with Todd. And the same goes for Mr. Peanutbutter. But I think the main difference between the two of them is that Todd... Well, for one thing, Todd just... He's like a force of nature. He just doesn't abide by the laws of mere mortals. He's just like a force of pure, I guess you would say, karma. Like, just what good you put into the world is eventually just going to come back to you if you keep your head up high. He is just curiosity and whim. Is whim a word? Whimsicalness? That's definitely not a word. But whatever that word is, incarnate. While Mr. Peanutbutter feels a little bit more real to me. I heard somebody say that they think Mr. Peanutbutter is just like a very, very deeply anxious person who is constantly working for the approval of everybody possible. And it definitely made me consider the character in a different light. But the way I've always seen Mr. Peanutbutter as a character is that he is, you know, a golden retriever puppy boy. He has a lot of love. He's just like a ball of energy, a ball of positive energy. He has a lot of love for pretty much anybody he meets and will stick to them and will see the best in them no matter what they do, pretty much. Will just stay by them and be loyal to them and be happy and be a positive influence on their life until the dog days are over. He is clearly at some points in the series displays a sense of sometimes anger, disappointment. He is sad dog occasionally, and general anxiety. But I think mostly his character has always been defined, in my eyes, as him being entitled. Not to say that when I say entitled, I guess I want to explain what I mean. Everything comes very easily to Mr. Peanutbutter for a lot of reasons. When he first got the gig for the Horsing Around ripoff or whatever, Mr. Peanutbutter's house. I don't remember what it was called. I believe it was Mr. Peanutbutter's house or something along those lines. He did it totally by accident. He's just naturally, endlessly charismatic, energetic, and positive. And generally speaking, everybody loves to be around that kind of guy. He, just by nature of being the way he is, falls into a great life. And more or less, everybody just loves and accepts and praises him. As, he's a good boy. But what immediately becomes evident when you see his dating record is that this is merely coincidence. The way he happens to be, fitting really well into what society wants him to be, is totally incidental. It's just how he is. He's not willing to change. He's not willing to sort of listen to others or accept criticism about himself very much at all. He's just likable. And eventually that likability begins to fade and people begin to leave him. And that's when he begins to get, obviously, very justifiably sad. I mentioned earlier that Mr. Peanutbutter tussles with the concept of nihilism from a very, very early point on in the series. It's one of the points that immediately humanizes him as oh, wait, this guy's a real emotionally disturbed person. Not in the sense that he's especially emotionally disturbed. I don't think he is whatsoever. Things just come easily to him. But I think every person with any amount of self-awareness is somewhat emotionally disturbed, and being able to express that just allows me to buy into the character a little bit more, for sure. I don't know where I'd have this sort of rift with Todd as a character, because he has... Actually, he doesn't really have many character flaws. Most of what he would have that could be perceived as flaws just sort of spontaneously, just randomly spiral into a positive for everybody involved. And it just feels like he has problems, and he is able to solve those problems in a reasonable manner. And when things come up, Todd generally solves them and comes out the other side okay. But with Todd, I don't know. It just feels like that's what it is. He always comes out the other side okay. With Mr. Peanutbutter, it's that's usually how it is, because he might not be gifted with the cosmic endowment of immeasurable luck that Todd has. He, is very entitled. Mr. Peanutbutter, it begins to wear off. He begins to realize that he's not able to get all the things he wants just by being positive and simple-minded and constantly happy and himself and not really listening to other people. It leads him down some pretty bad pathways in terms of the moral things he does, when he gets really into fracking, when he gets fracking it up in, I believe, season 3. Season 4. That was season 4 when he fracked. But it leads him to do some really bad things because he just sort of willfully suspends his sense of self-awareness because he's able to, because things come so easy to him. And when things don't, that makes him very angry. He's like a flawed, real character in that sense that I can really relate to. But Todd seems like more comic relief. In a sense, he can be an aspirational figure, as weirdly enough, he might be the most functional person in the show, despite, being homeless and all that other stuff, which is the problem he runs into in the final arc of the series with his dad. His dad wants him to have a very traditionally successful life. His mom wants him to have a very traditionally successful life with a traditionally prestigious occupation, and for him to be financially well off and well respected. But Todd's happy without any of those things, and that's sort of something that I guess we should all aspire to. But I don't know. For me personally, I liked him best in comic relief scenarios because I have a little bit of a disconnect there for whatever reason. So I'm team Peanut Butter all the way, because Team Peanut Butter's world is low-key finally crumbling around him, and I think that's really interesting. I think it's a really interesting concept to explore, and I like how when things start to crumble around him, because he's so unfamiliar, he doesn't really know how to act and responds in some really stupid and irrational ways that end up hurting other people. He's not a particularly super good guy, but he's also like the goodest guy, and he's very pure, and he just spreads happiness everywhere and will be by your side till the end. So I think he's an incredible friend, and he's a terrible partner. And that's pretty much all I have to say about this topic. I like that Diane is a writer, because I'm kind of a writer, and one of my favorite anime characters, Sengoku Nadeko, is a writer. And Alexander the Great from Fate Zero is a writer, which isn't quite a writer. I went to school with a guy named Ryder, and I actually used to play flag football, and there was another guy named Ryder.